Hello everyone, and welcome back to CICI 201X again, brought to you by the HCP, which is me, and it is my continued mission to bring you the best education that money cannot buy. So today we're going to talk about servlets and Ajax, how to use them in Java. The video is going to be split into two parts. The first part covers servlets, and the second part covers how to use Ajax with the servlets. And without further ado, let's get into it. For this video, I'm using Eclipse because when it comes to Tomcat and dealing with all the web stuff, IntelliJ and Eclipse generates really different projects, and they're actually not compatible with each other. For your guys' convenience and to lessen your confusion, I'm going to just stick with Eclipse for this one. Now, first of all, we need to create a new web project in Eclipse, and that's called a dynamic web project. So here we go to File, New, and we go to Dynamic Web Project. Let's give it a name, shall we? Let's call it CICI 201X JSP Servlet Ajax Demo. It's a really long name, but that's fine. And let's click on Next. Everything looks good. Next. Everything looks fine. Okay, finish. Now you can see here we have our new project. And in here, the two important folders are Java resources and web content. So first of all your web pages, your CSS files, your HTML, your JSP, they all go into web content. And your servlet or quote-unquote backend code, they all go into the source folder because they're still Java code. So first of all, I actually have an HTML template that I'm going to use that I made. Because we're not going to cover how to do HTML and how to do CSS because that's going to take up a lot of time, and you guys, that's actually easier than servlets and Ajax, and you guys can figure that out on your own. I'm just going to cover how it works with servlets and Ajax. Okay, so now we have all of our files here. So we have index.jsp, we have a results.jsp, and we have a CSS file. Now we're not going to worry about the CSS file in this video. We're just worrying about the JSP files. So first of all, I've been saying first of all a lot of times. I probably should stop doing that. But what is the difference between a JSP file and an HTML file? Honestly, there is very little difference. A JSP file does not need an HTML file. JSPs are implicit servlets themselves, so you can pretty much do everything in the JSP if you wanted to. Now, this JSP file actually doesn't open in our browser, but we can simply, if we simply change, you can see here, if we simply do rename, change it to HTML, and then let's open this up, show in System Explorer, here it is, and we can just open it, oops. And you see that it opens up like a normal HTML file, except for this line over here. The question that I get a lot is that what is JSP considered? Like, is it considered as a front-end component or a back-end component? And in the slides it says it's back-end, but in reality it's kind of both, and you're going to find conflicting answers on this. So just don't get too hung up on the technicalities and the vocab of this. But what happens is basically all the JSP code, all the Java code in the JSP gets compiled server-side first, converted into HTML code, and then sent to your browser. So in a sense, it's backend because the server compiles the Java code in it. But in a different sense, it's also front-end because there are HTML elements in it. So let's change this back to a JSP file. I just wanted to show you guys that a JSP really is an HTML with a bunch of Java code. JSP. And now this website doesn't have, in its current state, it doesn't have any functionality. So if we run it here, run the server. And by the way, if you guys check this, always use the server when running this project. You don't have to, this screen won't pop up in the future, just saying, because I've been seeing a lot of people just keep clicking on this and it's kind of annoying, to be honest. Not for me, but for you. Okay. Open up a new window. And as you can see here, I try to do something. Of course, in the HTML code, I have it where this field is required. But in reality, this code has 0 functionality. So if I type something, I click submit, nothing happens. It's undefined because I haven't specified anything. So nothing really happens here. And if I click on this, it just goes back to home. If I click on this, it goes to my YouTube channel, which you should be subscribed to if you're in 201. All right. Or if you're not in 201, feel free. All right. The first thing we're going to do is, of course, create a servlet. So let's right-click on the source folder, new. First of all, let's create a package, because it is always good practice to have packages. And second, sometimes if you're in a dynamic web project and your servlet is not in the package, sometimes things don't work for some reason. Now let's name it com.usc.csci21x following the excellent naming convention here. Click finish, and in it let's go new servlet to create a servlet. Now the servlet, let's call it a demo servlet. All right. Next. And another question that I get a lot is that, should I use do get or do post? In reality, they're the same, because I can show you what happens here. So the code that it generates for you, you see here, the do post basically calls do get. So there really is no difference. And if you're annoyed that you have 2 functions going on, you can simply just change it to service, because service handles both. Now we have a servlet file here. And what exactly is a servlet? How does it work when it comes to processing requests from the front end? And now let me just show you a quick demo here. Let me hook this up to the servlet. Now we have this form here. Where's Safari? We have this form on the left side here that we're gonna process. We're gonna validate with our servlet. Our goal is to make sure every field is filled, and that if some field is missing, we refresh the page, but we keep whatever the user's already inputted. Okay? How can we hook up the form to the servlet to make it so that when we click on the submit button, it goes to the servlet? We can do that by adding an action to the form. Here's what we do. So in the form tag, at the end of it, just add action equals demo servlet. And take note here, because this is not the name of the servlet file. So this is not demo servlet.java, it is just demo servlet. Now where do I get the name demo servlet? It is not from the file name, it is from this, add web servlet demo servlet. So this is the entry point of the servlet. So I can change the name of this demo servlet to everything else, or I can actually, if I change this to demo servlet 1 and leave everything else alone, you have to change this to demo servlet 1 as well. But let's just keep the names the same, just for the sake of simplicity and practicality. Now let's do demo servlet. And when we do this, and when I click submit, I should see something happening, because the servlet basically, it gives you a response saying, it basically prints out something saying serve that and the servlet path. So let's run this. And when I click on, okay, I gotta fill something out. You see it says serve that CSVI21x which is exactly this line. So now that we know how to hook it up to the servlet, how can we do something meaningful with it, right? How can we process whatever the user inputted into the forms and do some validation work on it? So what happens when the user clicks on the submit button is that all the inputs in the form gets packed as parameters into the request object, and send over to the servlet. So it is really easy to get those inputs from the servlet. And I'll show you how to do that. So first of all, obviously they're all strings. Let's do name string equals request, and you can see here I can get the parameter and think of it as a map of sorts. I give it a key and it gives me back the value of it. Now what is the parameter's name though? The parameter's name is precisely, literally, the name that you give it in the forms in the HTML. So here for the name, for this name field, I have name equals name input. So I can simply do name input, and keep in mind you have to keep it in crow's feet because they're a string, and that's how you get it. So let's print this out just to see if it works. Ooh, shoot. Print lane, whatever, name string. And let's run this again. Let's run index. Actually, Tomcat automatically reloads things for you, so you can just see here, reloading context with name blah blah, which means that we don't have to restart the servlet. So let's do something. Let's type in SCP. There we go. Submit. Nothing happens because I deleted the response.getWriter.append. That basically prints out an HTML file. But in the console here, we can see we just got our name. We got our name input from the forms in the servlet. Now this is fantastic because that means we can get so many of the other stuff. We can do string. What's next? Email string equals request dot get parameter. That should be email input because I named it email input. Again, because I named it email input here in the HTML file. And next, let's do what's the next one? Next one's message string equals request dot get parameter message input. Let me delete all those useless comments. Okay. Now we have all three of our fields, and if you're not convinced, I'll just print them out for you. I'll actually keep this on the side here so it doesn't keep interrupting me. Keep it down here, that's fine. Alright. Alright, you see it says reloading context is completed, which means the hot reload just finished. So let's do submit again. And you can see everything I typed in with pretty poor formatting, but you can see here we got everything I typed in. So now let's do some validation on this. And because I already did some HTML validation here in the JSP, in the HTML code, because I added the required tags. And that's basically saying that you cannot submit this form without filling this in. So if I click on submit, the HTML stops me even before anything gets to the servlet. So all we have to do really, because in this case, the way I coded this is that only the name is not validated by the front end. Which is not very nice because people can simply go and edit your HTML files. But for the sake of saving some code, I'm just going to do it this way. And now if I leave the name blank, you see I can still submit it, but I don't have the name anymore. So we got to check for the name on the back end. How are we going to do that? We can do that, of course, by using simple if statements. So if the name string equals to null, or name string equals, or name string.empty. Okay, you see I'm doing both because sometimes get parameter would give you a null, and other times it would give you an empty string depending on the type of input. Because it could be an input, it could be a radio button, it could be this and that. So there are lots of things to expect. So it's always good to first check for null and then check if it's empty. And in this case, let's print something out just for me, just so that I can show you that it works. Empty name. All right. Now let's wait for it to reload. All right. Completed. Okay. And you see here, it says empty name. You see my name's empty, and I do something, it says empty name. Okay. So we can check for this. Now, our goal is that when we have an empty name, we want the page to display some error message, but also essentially refreshing the page, but keeping everything else that the user has inputted. How can we add stuff in the servlet to the request object so that the page can get it in the JSP? And we can do that, but first of all, we have to specify next page, what next page is. So that's not string. So that is the page that we want to go to next. And the plan here is that if the user enters everything correctly, it should go to this results.jsp. I can show you what it is. And I can show, and you can see here everything's, it says placeholder for everything except for email, because I probably left that out. But everything says placeholder. And our goal is that if the user fills in the form correctly, all those should be populated with whatever the user has inputted. But if the user inputted something wrong, we're just going to stay on the home page and tell them that they have to finish the form. And how can we do that? So first of all, we specify the next page to be results.jsp. Right? So if everything goes correctly, we're going to get the results. So in this case, if the name is not empty, and because I know that the other things are certainly not empty because I validated it on the front end, we're just going to do else. Actually, not even, I only have to do else. Empty name, I'll just do, and because when the user enters something wrong, I want them to stay on the same page, the next page should be index.jsp itself. All right? And then we're going to have to use something called a request dispatcher. Now, what is a request dispatcher? A request dispatcher is something that handles the forwarding and various processing of requests. In this case, we're going to use, I'll explain a bit after I type this out, get servlet context.get request dispatcher. Next page. Now let me explain this for a brief bit. So get servlet context is pretty self-explanatory. You don't really have to understand it if you don't understand it. It's just something that you need. And get request dispatcher is just getting this. And the argument here is the URL of the next page that you want to go to. Okay, and so in this case, the next page variable. And then the way that we can forward the users to the next page along with the request and response objects is by doing dispatcher actually, dot forward and request and response. So this is the request and response, and it forwards them as is to the next page. But what if I want to add in an error message? I want to tell the users that, hey, you screwed up, you didn't fill out the form. I want to display that when the index page gets displayed again. So how can we essentially add something into the request object so that it can be read out later, like an error message? And intuitively, you probably think, oh, because we're getting a parameter here, we can just set a parameter, right? But the problem is we can't really set a parameter in the servlet. But what we can do is set an attribute. Now this is a place where it's really easy to get mixed up, because sometimes even myself, I'd be setting an attribute in the servlet, and in the JSP I'll be trying to do a get parameter and wonder why things aren't working because it's an attribute, not a parameter. Just remember that you cannot set a parameter in the servlet. You can only set an attribute, but you can also get the attribute elsewhere. Now let's just do request dot set. You see when I type in set, it doesn't, nothing about parameter shows up, it's just attribute. Let's do set attribute. And the name, again, it's like a key value pair. So I'll name it error message. And the error message would be, please fill in the name. All right. So now we set the attribute so that it could be read later from the JSP file. And if I just run this program right now, you're going to see that nothing really is going to happen. Let me refresh, although it doesn't really matter. You see nothing happens. The page refreshes and everything is cleared out, which is expected because we didn't really tell it to do anything otherwise. Now this is where the JSP code comes into play. Now, how does that work? Let me show you. So first of all, recall that we're setting an attribute in a servlet here, and then we're setting the attribute in the request object, and we're passing the request object into the next page, which is in this case index.jsp itself, right? So what we can do here in index.jsp is that, now first of all, how do we add JSP code? This is, by the way, this is how you do comments in HTML. Okay. The way you do JSP code is by doing this bracket and percentage sign. And you see it all completes it for me. And in here, you are basically in a implicit do get or do post method. And why is that? Let me show you. So in here you can basically, this is all Java code right now. So this is the power of JSP. You can type Java code in your JSP file, and then the server's gonna compile it, and then turn anything necessary into HTML code to display on the front end. And this is essentially backend logic here, which is why some people say JSP files are backend. So let's get the user's inputs first from the previous form. Let's do string email string. You know what? It's basically an implicit servlet, so I can literally copy the code and put it here. And you see that they work. No errors. Because as I said, you're implicitly in this method. But not this specific one, but in a doGet method. So you have access to the request and response parameters or variables. Now from here, what should I do from here? I should also get the error message, obviously. So that would be request.get. You see it starts to autocomplete for me because this is all Java. So let's do, and take note here, it is get attribute, not get parameter. Because recall again, we were setting the attribute, not the parameter. So if you do get parameter error message, which is the key here, you're not going to get anything because there's nothing. Let's do error message. And it's going to warn me that it cannot convert object to string. And now why is that? So if I type set attribute here, you can see that it takes in a string as a key, but an object as a value. So you can actually pass in objects, let's say some array list or something else, and then use it on the front end. That is very useful. But we know that because I literally wrote this code right here. So we know that this is a string. So we're gonna cast it to a string. So next what we're gonna do is, of course, we're gonna check if we do have an error message or not, and if we do have a mail string or not, we do have a message string or not. And we have to check them because this JSP code gets run regardless of in what context you're opening up the index.jsp. So it could be the first time you're visiting index.jsp, and all of them would be null. But you can't just display them because they would just say null. So you have to do something about them. Now, how can we do this? We can just do if. Actually, I'm going to do something clever here, because if we do not have an error message, so in no case, there is no such case that the user fills in everything correctly and we still go back to index. We always go to results. So the only time that we should be filling in email and message is when we have an error. So let's check for the error first. If the error message isn't null, and because we don't have to do this, we don't have to do these two until we get into this if statement, because again, the user will only need those fields to be refilled if they filled in something wrong and they get a message. So if they don't get an error message, it can only mean that it is their first time visiting index.jsp, or this redirection isn't coming from this demo servlet. So let's move some of this stuff in here. I'll copy this here. And let me just make those empty strings instead. All right. So if we do have an error message, then let's fill in the email and message. All right. And else, let's make the error message an empty string, because otherwise, if it's null, it would literally print out null on your front end, which doesn't look very good. Okay. So now we got the previous user's inputs and the error message. How can we place them into the HTML files, right? Into the HTML tags. And we can do that again by using this bracket and percentage sign notation here. So I want to display the error message maybe below this name input, and we want to refill in those fields if necessary. So let's just put this. Let's put the error message here. So it's really simple. You do this notation again, and to note that this is something you want to display, you add a equal sign here, and you can just do error message. You see it pops up, error message. Let's run this again. Actually, I don't have to because it reloaded for me. Let's just type in an empty name actually. Fake email data. And let's click on submit. And what I expect to happen is to have an error message to display under the name input. And there we go. Look at this. But we still have a problem because our email and messages our email and message input fields are still empty. And we want to fill them in with whatever the user filled in last time. The way to do that for the email tag is that, so in this input, you can have, there's something called value, okay? A value attribute. Now you can name it to whatever you want. Let's say I name it this whatever thing and I refresh it. You can see that it's now pre-filled with this garbage. Now instead of garbage, I want to put something else. I want to put the email string here. And let's do the same notation again. Email string. If I refresh, nothing should show. Oh yeah, that was from last time because I still have this request here. There we go. All right, so let's not type in the name. Let's type in my US email. Some random message. You see that it says please fill in the name, and I still have my email. Now what about the message field? Okay, the message field it's not an input, it's a text area, and the way you can do that is it's basically you just put stuff between those tags. So all you have to do is percentage sign equals is that message string? And there we go. And now if we do something here, you can see that everything works. So let me do that again. You see that they're being preserved, which is very nice. And let me show you what happens if I don't do this part. Okay, comment this out. Like you don't clear it, and let me show you what it actually displays when it's null. It just says null. So you should always, when you get a null value here, you should always just change it. if you need a display on the front end, always manually change it to an empty string. Otherwise, it's literally going to say null. So now we're done with this part here. We're done with the error part. But what about when the user inputs everything correctly? Because if I input everything correctly here, and I click submit, I just go to the results page with nothing. How can we fix that? And we can fix that by going to results.jsp. And again, let's add some JSP code, shall we? All right. So what we can do here is, again, we can do string name equals request.get parameter name input. Now, why does this work? It works because, now recall that the moment we click on submit in index.jsp, it goes to the demo servlet.java, it goes to demo servlet as parameters in the request object. And we never touched it. I mean, we read from it, but we never really modified or deleted it. So it's still in the request object. And we're forwarding the page using request dispatcher. We're forwarding the entire request object. So whatever was in the request object is still in the request object. So we can still get it in results.jsp. That's why it works. And we can do that for name, we can do that for email, we can do that for everything. Email equals request.get parameter email input. Right? Let's do the same here for message. Get parameter message input. Now we could get the error message if we wanted to, but there won't be one because the only way that the users are seeing the results page is if they fill out the form correctly. So now we have the three things we want to replace the placeholder with. And we can just do that by, again, using the percentage sign syntax. Name. And yep, I missed that one. Let's do email. You see it pops up, which means that it's good. It works. Message. Here. We're gonna do search later. That'll be the next video on Ajax. So now we don't have to run this again because it reloads itself for me. Let's type in a name. Actually, no, this is my name. HCP. Email. It's my email message. I don't know, 1, 2, 3. Okay. I agree. Submit. And we should see the results page with everything filled in. And indeed, we do. So again, to recap, a lot of people are confused on how the, for lack of a better term, the flow of information flows when it comes to serverless and JSPs. So first of all, the user inputs stuff. First of all, the user types your inputs into the form, into this form, name, email, and message. And then the moment we click on the submit button, it goes to it looks at the action attribute here, and it says demo servlets. So it collects those things. It puts it puts the name, message, email, message into the request object as parameters and sends it to the servlet. The servlet gets it by using request.get parameter, does things with it. Let's say, in this case, we validated if the name is null. And if so, we set an error message as an attribute, again, not a parameter, an attribute in the request object. And we sent the request object back to the user and also redirected them to, again, the index.jsp page, which is the same page. But now the page has new information because we added all those stuff into the request object. So when index.jsp loads, it checks if there is an error message. And if there is, it refills the email and message fields and displays the message promptly. And if there is no error message, let's say if we're just visiting this page for the first time, the error message is going to be null because we never set it anywhere. We never set the attribute anywhere. So it's going to go into this else block, and everything else is going to be empty. So nothing's going to show up. And if the user does manage to input all the fields, again, we forward the user to results.jsp. We use the same method to get those inputs from the request parameter, because again, the form is putting all those information, all the user's inputs, into the request object, which gets sent to the demo servlet. The demo servlet in turn forwards it to the next page, which is results.jsp. And that is why we still have access to those parameters from results.jsp. And that is why we can still display whatever the user inputted here on a different page. Now let's just do that again. Let's do SCP email. That's my email. And the message, some message, right? And now you see we get those. Alright guys, so this is the end of the servlet portion of this video. But in part 2, we're going to talk about Ajax. I've uploaded all those code onto my GitHub so that you can reference them later. And thanks for watching your HSCP. Again, it is my continued mission to bring you the best education that money cannot buy. Subscribe, like the video, and I'll see you next time in part 2.